Harmless Herbivores, the day humans broke the galaxy. The Korvath Dominion had catalogued 11,000 sapient species across 4 spiral arms, and every single one of them had been filed, measured, and ranked according to the threat calculus before their homeworlds ever knew they'd been found. It was a beautiful system. Cold, symmetrical, absolute. A species was assigned a number between 0 and 100 based on weapons technology, population density, resource competition, and this was the part that mattered here: emotional volatility. High volatility meant high unpredictability, and unpredictability was, to the Dominion, the only sin that mattered. The Korvath themselves had bred it out of their own bloodlines 11,000 years ago, back when their homeworld nearly cooked itself in a war fought entirely over which shade of blue was more sacred. Since then, every Korvath child was fitted at birth with a neural suppressor no larger than a grain of rice, tucked behind the left auditory ganglion, humming at a frequency that flattened joy and grief alike into the same gray hum of acceptable function. They called it the calm. They considered it their greatest invention. They considered it proof that they had grown up, in the way a species grows up, the way a wildfire grows into a controlled hearth. So when the long-range drones came back from the third planet of a yellow dwarf star in an unremarkable spiral limb and returned a threat calculus score of 6, a number so low it was usually reserved for slime colonies and coral reefs, the Grand Assessor's office did not send a war fleet. They did not send a diplomatic envoy. They sent 17 scouts. 17 was the standard number for what the Dominion called a passive cultural harvest, the quiet, bloodless art of watching a species long enough to know exactly how to dismantle it later without ever needing to fire a shot. The 17 chosen were the best the Dominion had, decorated, precise. Each one had spent decades in cloaked orbit around a dozen different worlds, invisible as held breath, filing reports so clean and so cold that entire committees used them as training material. They were not soldiers, they were scalpels. Their target species called itself, in its own dominant tongue, human, and its planet's own scientists. In the brief scraps of radio chatter the drones had scraped from low orbit, called it, affectionately and without irony, a pale blue dot. The pre-mission briefing, delivered in the flat, unmodulated tone that all Korvath briefings were delivered in, described humanity in 4 lines that would later become, within the Dominion's classified archives, the single most embarrassing document in 11,000 years of institutional history. Bipedal, omnivorous, technologically adolescent, having only recently split the atom and reached their own moon. Emotionally volatile to a degree unseen in any catalogued species, running on chemical impulses the Korvath had surgically removed from themselves 100 centuries ago. The recommendation, stamped in the sterile violet ink reserved for the highest levels of Dominion clearance, read simply, "Harmless herbivores. Proceed with standard cultural harvest. No combat protocols required." The 17 ships slid into Earth's shadow like coins dropped into still water, cloaked so completely that not even the most advanced human radar array could have caught more than a flicker of static, a held breath in the ionosphere. Scout Commander V. Hennick Tal, callsign designation 7, was the first to drop his ship into low geostationary orbit above a landmass the humans called North America. And the first thing he logged in his mission journal, dictated in the clipped, tonally dead cadence of a species that had forgotten how to raise its voice, was this: "The target world is loud." Not merely in the electromagnetic sense, though that too in obscene abundance. Every frequency band from the deep hums of AM radio to the glittering chatter of satellite relays was so saturated with human transmission that V. Hennick's own ship's filters had to work 3 times as hard as they had over any other world in the catalog. No, the world was loud in a way his instruments had no proper unit to measure. It was loud with a species roughly 8 billion strong, packed onto 6 inhabited continents in a way that should have, by every Korvath model of civilizational stability, produced constant, grinding warfare. And there was warfare, yes, scattered here and there, ugly little fires the Dominion's analysts marked down with clinical disinterest. But it was not the dominant note. The dominant note, V. Hennick wrote and then struck through, and then wrote again because he could not think of a better word, was noise that sounded like joy. He did not understand the word yet. He would. The first scout to go dark was not V. Hennick. It was Call Saint 11, a scout named Prena Dosh who had spent 100 in D40 Korvath years surveying 6 different species without so much as an elevated heartbeat, and whose file, later recovered and studied with something approaching horror by Dominion psychologists, showed that his undoing began with something as small as a single afternoon in a city the humans called New Orleans. Pren's mission had been simple: land and human guys using the Dominion's standard biomimetic overlay, walk among the population, and catalog their art, their food, and their rituals for the purposes of psychological exploitation. His overlay was flawless. He walked through the French Quarter looking to any passerby, like an unremarkable man in his 30s with tired eyes and an unplaceable accent, and his internal sensors dutifully logged the temperature, the humidity, the chemical composition of the air thick with fry oil and river damp, and underneath it a green mineral smell that 11,000 years of Korvath cataloging had never once needed a word for, because no world the Dominion had surveyed smelled quite like a human city in summer. And then he heard the trumpet. It came from an open doorway on a street called Frenchman, spilling out into the wet evening air along with a warm amber light that did not match any lighting specification the Dominion used in its own architecture. Because Korvath buildings were lit for efficiency, not for the specific psychological effect of making a stranger feel, upon merely glancing inside, that he was welcome. The trumpet was playing something loose and drunk and joyful, a phrase that bent and cracked and slid up into a register that should have sounded like an error, like a machine malfunctioning, and instead sounded like the exact opposite of error, like a living thing insisting gloriously on its own imperfection. Pren's internal suppressor, a Dominion standard model tuned to flatten precisely this kind of neurochemical spike, did something in that moment that would take Dominion engineers 4 months to properly model afterward. It failed, not through any malfunction of hardware. It failed because the emotional signal coming off that trumpet, amplified by the trombone answering it, amplified further by a room full of humans clapping offbeat and stomping their feet and laughing with their whole bodies, was simply larger than the suppressor had ever been built to handle. The Korvath had built their emotional dampeners to manage a species that, at its wildest, had once burned a hemisphere over the correct shade of blue. They had never built anything to withstand a New Orleans brass band on a humid Tuesday night, because no engineer in the history of the Dominion had ever imagined they would need to. Pren stood in that doorway for 6 hours. His ship in orbit sent 17 automated queries asking for his position. He did not answer a single one. He later told a human bartender, in a voice that cracked in a way his species had not physically been capable of producing in 10,000 years, that he did not understand what was happening to him, only that for the first time in 140 years of life he did not want it to stop. 3 days later, Pren's cloaked ship set down in a fallow field outside Baton Rouge, in full view of a dairy farmer named Wesley Boudreau, who would later tell a very confused Air Force debriefing team that the silver thing had landed gentle as a moth, and that the fella who climbed out of it had asked him, first thing completely deadpan, whether he happened to have any hot sauce. The Dominion command structure did not immediately understand what they were looking at. Scout reports were, by design, infrequent. A species undergoing passive cultural harvest was not meant to know it was being watched, and a scout who checked in too often risked detection. So when Pren's transmissions stopped, the analysts back at Fleet Command initially logged it as equipment failure, a rare but not unheard of event given the electromagnetic chaos the target world generated. They dispatched a standard diagnostic query. It went unanswered. They upgraded the flag from equipment failure to possible compromise, the Dominion's polite term for captured or destroyed, and prepared with their usual bloodless efficiency a contingency plan that assumed Scout 11 was either dead or in enemy hands. They were not prepared for the truth. that Scout 11 was, at that exact moment, sitting on a plastic lawn chair in Wesley Boudreau's backyard, eating a bowl of gumbo so spicy it had brought actual tears to eyes that had not produced tears in a century and a half, and describing the experience out loud, unprompted, as the first time I have ever been glad to be in pain. Scout Commander V. Hennick Tal read the compromise flag on Prena Dash's file with the same flat attention he gave every administrative notice, filed it, and returned to his own observations, entirely unaware that he had 11 days left before the same thing. Happened to him. It happened in a city called Tokyo, though the specific location would later prove almost comically unremarkable. A rooftop bar 4 stories above a street thick with the electric hum of vending machines and the wet neon smear of a rain-soaked crosswalk. Red and gold and impossible teal all bleeding together on the black asphalt like the entire street had been painted by someone who had never once believed in restraint. V. Hennick had gone there in his human overlay to observe what the Dominion's cultural files vaguely classified as recreational congregation behavior, the same bloodless language they used for every species equivalent of a bar or a temple or a public square. He ordered, because his research notes told him it was customary, a glass of something the bartender called whiskey, and he sat at the edge of the rooftop with a recording device disguised as a wristwatch, and he watched the city breathe. It was the lights that got him first. Not because they were bright, the Dominion's own capital cities were plenty bright, engineered for maximum visibility with the same flat clinical precision as everything else they built, but because they were unnecessary. Half the neon in that street was advertising things no rational species would need advertised twice. A coffee shop with a sign so elaborate it looped and pulsed through 6 different colors just to say, essentially, coffee is here. A pachinko parlor whose entire facade seemed to be having a nervous breakdown of silver and crimson light for no purpose V. Hennick's threat models could identify except, he eventually admitted to himself, delight. Someone somewhere in this species' history had looked at the basic requirement of communicate that a shop exists and had decided apparently unanimously across an entire civilization that the correct response was to make it beautiful or funny or strange far beyond what function demanded. The waste of it should have offended his training. Instead, it did something his training had no protocol for at all. It made his hands, resting on the rooftop railing, feel unaccountably light. Then someone in the bar put on a record, an actual physical record, spinning on a turntable behind the counter with a soft crackling hiss that V. Hennick's audio sensors initially flagged as signal degradation, before he understood that the imperfection was, impossibly, the point. It was a woman's voice, low and worn and cracking slightly at the edges of certain notes in a way that a Korvath vocal coach would have corrected out of a singer in her first training session. And she was singing about, his translation matrix took a moment to parse the metaphor, the moon and a river, and being out there somewhere, waiting to see the world from a moving vantage point wide enough to hold everything she loved. V. Hennick did not know the phrase moon river. He would learn it later. Along with several hundred other phrases, he would spend the rest of his very long life unable to hear without his throat tightening. What he knew in that moment, sitting on a rooftop in the rain-smeared light of a species his empire had rated a 6 out of 100, was that something in his chest, an organ his own biology textbooks described purely in terms of pump pressure and oxygenation, was doing something it had not done since he was an unaugmented child, before the comm had been surgically installed behind his ear at the standard age of 4. It was aching, pleasantly, unbearably, on purpose somehow, though he could not imagine what purpose an ache could serve. He filed no report that night. He filed no report the next night either. On the 4th night, Fleet Command flagged Scout Commander V. Hennick Tal, their most decorated observer, their cleanest and coldest asset, as a second possible compromise. By the time the Grand Assessor's office convened an emergency session to discuss the situation, the number had climbed to 5. 5 of 17 elite scouts, gone dark, gone silent, in a period of less than 3 weeks, on a world the Dominion's own analysts had rated as offering no combat protocols required. The assessor in charge of the Harmless Herbivores file, a severe administrator named Karnath Oz who had overseen 43 successful passive cultural harvests without a single procedural anomaly, stood before a holographic display of the target world and did the only thing his training had ever prepared him to do when faced with an anomaly. He demanded more data, and he demanded it flattened, translated, stripped of whatever contaminating variable was clearly infecting the collection process. The data came in anyway, and it was anything but flattened. It came from Scout 14, a woman named Asa Ren who had gone dark in a city called Rio de Janeiro and whose final transmission, sent in the 11 seconds before she disabled her own tracking beacon for good, was not a report at all. It was a recording, unauthorized, unfi. Altered 22 minutes of raw audio-visual capture that Asa had apparently made no attempt to hide, as though she needed, someone back home to see it before she vanished entirely into the noise of the world she'd been sent to judge. The recording showed a beach at what the humans called Carnival, a wall of drums so dense and so layered that the Dominion's audio analysts initially assumed some kind of jamming technology before they understood, with visible distress on their otherwise placid faces, that it was simply hundreds of human beings playing percussion instruments in simultaneous, joyful, imperfect unison. The recording showed bodies of every shape and color moving in ways that had no tactical purpose whatsoever, dressed in feathers and sequins, and paint in colors so saturated they made the Dominion's own official palette grays, blue-grays. The occasional muted violet reserved for ceremony look, by comparison, like a species that had confused restraint for wisdom. And then the recording showed Asa Ren herself, briefly, caught in a mirror on a food stall she'd stopped at, her human overlay flickering slightly at the edges from what her own sensors would later confirm was emotional overload bleeding into the biomimetic field. She was crying, she was also laughing. Her voice, picked up faintly by the device's microphone, said something in halting Portuguese that the translation matrix rendered imperfectly, as I did not know a body could hold this much at once. Assessor Karnath Oz watched the recording twice in complete silence, and then ordered it purged from the record and never spoken of again, a directive that 3 separate junior analysts quietly disobeyed by making personal copies before their shift ended. Copies that would circulate, in total violation of a dozen Dominion security protocols, through increasingly wider circles of increasingly unsettled Korvath citizens over the following months. It did not stay contained, of course. Nothing on this scale ever does, and the Dominion, for all its cold engineering, had never once had to design a containment protocol for a feeling. The recording of Asa Ren crying and laughing at once on a Rio beach found its way within a season onto private data shares among Korvath adolescents who had never in their sanctioned, suppressor-fitted lives seen an adult of their own species display an expression that intense, that uncontained, that unashamed. They watched it in secret, in dim dormitory rooms after curfew, passing a single data slate hand to hand, and the reaction among them was not, as the assessor's office had feared, revulsion. It was hunger. A girl named Tira Osk, 16 years old, later confessed to a disciplinary tribunal that she had watched the recording 41 times in a single month, and that each time she had pressed 2 fingers against the small raised scar behind her own left ear and wondered, with a kind of despair she had no framework for describing, what her own face might look like doing that, feeling that, if only someone would let her. 3 separate youth dormitories reported a sudden, statistically anomalous spike in suppressor tampering that season, young Korvath attempting, clumsily, with kitchen tools and stolen medical implements, to pry the devices loose from behind their own ears, sometimes successfully, more often not. Occasionally with injuries the Dominion's medical corps filed under a euphemism so bloodless it might have been funny if it weren't so plainly a symptom of panic. Elective neural modification, unauthorized. Assessor Karnath Oz convened a private session with 6 of his most senior colleagues to discuss what he privately began referring to, in notes he never intended anyone else to read, as the contagion problem, though every attempt to define it scientifically collapsed under its own weight. It was not a virus, in any sense their pathologists could isolate. Every scout who had gone dark showed a biology entirely uncompromised, no foreign agent, no chemical alteration beyond what any Korvath body produced naturally when its own suppressor was removed or overwhelmed. It was not technically a weapon, since nothing about human civilization appeared engineered toward Korvath specifically, or indeed toward any external audience at all. Humans built their music and their food and their paintings, as far as anyone could determine, essentially for each other, and simply happened with a carelessness that felt almost insulting in its innocence, to have built something that worked on anyone who got close enough to feel its heat. "We are being dismantled," Karnath Oz finally admitted in the flattest voice he could manage to a room of colleagues whose own composure was, by that point, fraying visibly at the edges. "By a species that does not know we exist, using a weapon they never intended to build that they deploy constantly on each other for no reason but the joy of it, and I do not know how the calm is supposed to survive contact with a species that has simply never needed one." There was, too, the matter of Scout 9, a quiet, unremarkable operative named Das Illerin who had drawn what every other scout privately considered the least interesting assignment on the entire mission. A mid-sized city in the American Midwest, chosen by Fleet Command specifically because its cultural output registered on every prior satellite metric as unremarkable, provincial, statistically average in every category that mattered. Das had expected boredom. He found, instead, a single-screen movie theater on a Friday night showing a film that had been playing, according to the marquee, for 11 consecutive weeks to a town of 40,000 people, most of whom appeared to have already seen it at least once. He sat in the dark theater among strangers who laughed at the same three jokes he did not yet understand, and cried without embarrassment at a scene near the end in which an elderly man finally said the thing to his estranged son that he had spent the entire film failing to say. And Das found his own hands trembling, gripping the plush arms of his theater seat because he understood with a suddenness that felt almost violent that he had just watched two fictional strangers, invented entirely from nothing by other humans he would never meet, resolve in 94 minutes an ache that Das's own species had spent 11,000 years simply pretending it did not have. He watched the film again the following night, and then the night after that, memorizing the exact cadence of the son's voice when he finally forgave his father, until the theater's elderly projectionist, a widower named Hal who ran the place alone since his wife's passing, began saving Das a seat without being asked, and one evening, closing up together long after the last showing had ended, Hal put on a record of his late wife's favorite song, Something Slow. Built around a single aching saxophone line that curled up and never quite resolved, holding its listener in permanent, gorgeous suspension, and told Das, unprompted, that he still danced to it in the empty lobby some nights, badly, alone, because it was the only way he knew to keep dancing with her at all. Das danced with him that night, badly too, two strangers from further apart than either could have imagined moving slowly in a dim lobby that smelled of stale popcorn and floor wax, and he sent no report to his ship for 6 days afterward, and when he finally did send one, it contained a single line: "I came here to assess a species for conquest. I have instead learned what it is to grieve someone I never met through a stranger who let me borrow his." By the 6th week of the mission, 9 of the 17 scouts had gone dark. By the 8th week, it was 13. The remaining 4 sent increasingly erratic reports back to Fleet Command, reports that read less like professional intelligence and more like men and women standing at the edge of something enormous, trying to describe it honestly while some older, colder part of themselves screamed that describing it honestly was itself the first symptom of infection. One of the 4, Scout Commander Baron Vask, filed a report that the assessor's office would later cite, in internal Dominion inquiries, as the clearest articulation of the crisis. This species has weaponized joy as a survival trait. They do not merely tolerate emotional volatility, they have built entire civilizations designed to maximize it, structures they call concerts and festivals and cinemas, whose sole engineered purpose is to produce, deliberately and at scale, the exact neurochemical states our own calm was built to eliminate. I do not believe this is a defense mechanism against invasion. I believe, and I say this with the full weight of 160 years of clean service, that it is simply how this species has always lived, and that we mistook their capacity for joy as a weakness because we no longer remember what our own capacity for it used to feel like. Baron Vask went dark 9 days after filing that report. His ship was later found, decloaked and gently parked, in a field outside a town in rural Ireland, where he had apparently been spending his evenings in the corner of a pub listening to a fiddle player named Aoife who taught him, over the course of one long, slow week, how to hold a bow. The 4 remaining active scouts became 3, then 2 with a final transmission from a scout stationed above a city called Mexico City, who reported watching a mural painter fill an entire crumbling apartment wall with the faces of his neighborhood's dead in colors so defiantly alive that the scout wrote, in his last coherent line before his own signal cut, "I understand now why they paint their grief instead of hiding it." 1 scout remained, technically, actively reporting, Scout Commander Vihenik Tal, whose early compromise flag had, in a fit of bureaucratic confusion, never been properly upgraded from possible to confirmed, and who, alone among all 17, had made a peculiar choice that the Dominion's psychologists would spend years trying to understand. He had not gone fully dark. He kept transmitting, brief and irregular, fragments that read less like intelligence reports and more like a man narrating his own slow dissolution to whoever back home might still be listening, as if some last professional habit refused to let the silence be total, even as everything underneath that habit came apart. I have eaten something called ramen 41 times this month, one fragment read. It is structurally an inefficient meal: broth, noodle, egg, a slice of pork fat that serves no nutritional purpose the Dominion would sanction. And yet I find that I plan my day around it. I do not understand wanting something that serves no strategic function. I am beginning to suspect that is the entire point of it. Another reads, I watched a film tonight in a theater built to seat perhaps 300 humans, all strangers to one another, and at the end of it, when the 2 lead characters, who had spent the entire film failing to say what they meant to each other, finally embraced in the rain, I heard 40 separate humans, none of whom knew each other, quietly crying in the dark together, and none of them ashamed of it. And I understood in that moment that this species has built machines whose sole function is to manufacture shared feeling among strangers, and that they have been doing this, in one form or another, since before they had writing. The last fragment V. Hennick ever sent as a functioning agent of the Dominion arrived 4 days before he too decloaked his ship, this one in a wooded valley in a place the humans called Vermont, where he would spend the following spring learning to keep bees from a retired schoolteacher who never once asked him where he was really from. The fragment read simply, I do not think this is a weapon they built against us. I think it is only what happens to any of us, Korvath or human or otherwise, when the suppressor comes off and the world is finally allowed to hurt exactly as much as it is also allowed to be beautiful. Request immediate reassignment of my file to inactive status. I am not being held. I am not in danger. I have simply chosen to stay. The Grand Assessor's office received that transmission at 3:47 Dominion Standard Time, and by 400 the entire 17 Scout mission had been formally reclassified, in a closed-door session attended by only the highest tier of Dominion Command, from passive cultural harvest to Category 1 existential anomaly, a classification that had been used exactly twice before in recorded Dominion history, both times to describe weapons capable of unmaking a star. It was in the wake of that reclassification, in a chamber lit by the same flat gray light that lit every important room in the Dominion's capital, that Admiral Threx Calvane was summoned. Threx Calvane was, by every metric the Dominion possessed, the most stable officer in the fleet. He had commanded the pacification of the Ovar cluster without once raising his voice. He had overseen the peaceful absorption of 11 client species into Dominion administration with a level of dispassion that his own subordinates found privately almost inhuman even by Korvath standards. which was, of course, precisely why he had been chosen. His suppressor had been surgically reinforced twice in his career, once after a training accident that had killed 40 cadets under his command and left him, according to his medical file, appropriately regulated within 11 minutes, an efficiency the review board had commended without apparent irony. If any Korvath in the fleet could walk among the wreckage of 17 compromised scouts and remain untouched, the assessor's office reasoned it was Threx. He was given a single directive, delivered by Assessor Carnith Oz himself in a briefing room where the holographic display of Earth rotated slowly behind them both. Its blue oceans and white cloud swirls looking, Threx thought privately and did not say aloud, almost unbearably vivid against the flat gray of everything else in the room. Locate the source of the contagion. Determine whether it is deliberate biological or psychological warfare or an unintended emergent property of the species culture. Recommend either immediate quarantine of the entire system or immediate large-scale kinetic intervention. Do not, under any circumstances, engage with the compromised assets directly. Do not consume native food. Do not attend native cultural gatherings. Do not, Assessor Oz said, in the closest thing to genuine emotion Threx had ever heard cross his superior's voice, listen to their music. Threx Calvin took his orders, boarded a ship built for exactly this kind of singular, surgical mission, and descended tow. Ard the pale blue dot with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who did not yet understand that the mission had already, in some sense, begun the moment he'd looked at that rotating blue holographic sphere, and felt something in his chest that he did not have a word for yet, but that 17 other Korvath had, by then, already learned to call longing. He landed first not on Earth itself, but on the derelict hull of Scout 11's abandoned vessel, still parked in that fallow field outside Baton Rouge where Prena had left it 11 weeks earlier, now half swallowed by kudzu vine and visited apparently on a regular basis by the farmer Wesley Boudreaux, who kept it, against every instinct a rational species would expect, not out of fear or curiosity, but out of what could only be described. In the words he gave the very confused Air Force officer who eventually cornered him about it, as neighborliness. Threx walked the interior of the ship with a diagnostic scanner in one gloved hand, cataloging signs of tampering, sabotage, chemical contamination, anything that might explain the failure in purely mechanical terms. He found none. What he found instead, tucked into a storage compartment that should have held emergency rations, was a small paper bag containing what his scanner identified as a mixture of capsaicin heavy dried peppers, and beneath that, scrawled in Prena own precise Korvath script on the inside flap of the bag, a single line. If you're reading this, you're about to understand. Threx burned the bag in the ship's incinerator without opening it further, logged the find as inconclusive, and told himself, in the clean clinical language his training had given him for exactly this kind of moment, that Prena had simply suffered a rare and unfortunate neurological failure, an outlier, a statistical inevitability among any large enough sample of otherwise reliable agents. He did not yet understand that he had just made the same mistake every scout before him had made. He had assumed the danger was something that could be scanned for. His investigation took him, over the following month, to 11 of the 17 sites where compromised scouts had settled. He found Callsign 11 Prena living in a small apartment above a jazz club in New Orleans, working, of all things, as a line cook, his hands moving with a speed and precision that would have made him a formidable soldier, now devoted entirely to the construction of a dish called étouffée. When Threx confronted him in the alley behind the club, badge of Dominion authority displayed in the cold blue light of his sidearm's active targeting array, Pren did not run, and he did not deny anything. He simply looked at Threx with an expression the Admiral's own facial recognition training identified, with clinical precision, as pity. "You're going to ask me to come back," Pren said. His Korvath was rusty. He'd clearly been speaking more English than his own native tongue for weeks. "You're going to tell me my suppressors failed and it needs to be recalibrated. I want you to know I heard that exact argument in my own head for the first 3 days. Then I stopped hearing it because I finally asked myself a question nobody back home ever taught me to ask. What question? Threx said. He did not intend it as a genuine inquiry. His voice carried the same flat register it always did. Recalibrated back to what? Pren said. Back to feeling nothing. I spent 140 years feeling nothing, Admiral. I was very good at it. I was decorated for it. And in 6 weeks on this planet, I have felt more grief. When a man in the city told me about a hurricane that took his mother's house. Joy watching four strangers finish each other's trumpet lines like they'd rehearsed it their whole lives, though they'd met an hour before. And yes, Admiral, physical pain, real pain, from a bowl of soup, laughing while I cried from it. I have felt more in 6 weeks than in 140 years of being exactly what the Dominion built me to be. You can arrest me. I won't fight you. But I want it on your record that I would rather spend 1 year feeling all of that than another century feeling none of it. Threx did not arrest him. He told himself it was strategic, that a live, cooperative asset embedded in human society might yet prove useful for future intelligence gathering. And he logged Prenadash's location, and he left the alley, and he did not examine too closely why his hand, for just a moment as he turned to go, had hesitated over the open door of the jazz club where the trumpet was, at that exact moment, bending a note up into a register that sounded. Even through a closed door and 30 meters of humid New Orleans air, like an argument for something Threx did not yet have the vocabulary to name. He found Scout Commander Asa Wren in Rio, 3 months after her final compromised transmission, no longer working. As a scout of any kind, but as an assistant to a woman who ran a small community art program in a hillside favela, teaching children, actual human children, loud and unregulated and covered in paint, how to mix pigment from crushed brick dust and chalk, because proper paint was too expensive to buy in the quantities the program needed. Asa's overlay had degraded further than any other scout's Threx had examined. She barely bothered maintaining it anymore, letting her true Korvath features show through in patches when she forgot herself, blue-gray skin visible at her hairline in the honest daylight, and none of the children in her care seemed to find this remarkable in the slightest. Because, as one of them, a girl of perhaps 9, told Threx with the blunt confidence of a child who has decided an adult's question is beneath her notice, Miss Asa's just Miss Asa. She's from far away. Lots of people are from far away. He found Scout Commander Baron Vask in Ireland with a fiddle of his own now. Badly played, but played anyway. In front of a pub fire on a Tuesday night that no tactical calculus could have explained the value of. He found 6 others in 6 different cities, and every single one of them told him, in different words but with the exact same unbothered certainty, that they were not being controlled, were not sick, were not compromised in any sense the Dominion's threat models had a category for. They were, without exception, simply happy, and every one of them offered to buy Threx a meal, or play him a song, or show him something they'd made with their own 2 hands. And every one of them, without fail, was met with Threx's flat refusal and cold departure, logged dutifully in his mission report as evidence of continued asset noncompliance. It was in the 11th city, a place called Vienna, that his own suppressor first faltered, not failed, not yet, but faltered, the way a held note falters under too much sustained pressure. He had come to observe what human intelligence files described, in their own internal jargon, as a classical concert, reasoning that if any human cultural artifact could be assessed with pure clinical detachment, it would be this one. An orchestra disciplined hierarchical, every musician following a single conductor's precise instructions with a rigor that, on paper, resembled the Dominion's own organizational logic more closely than anything else he'd encountered on this world. He sat in the back row of a gilded hall built 2 centuries earlier by humans who could not have imagined, in their wildest ambitions, that the building would one day be visited by a species from another star. And he watched an orchestra of perhaps 90 musicians raise their instruments in complete silence, and then begin. The piece was Beethoven's 9th Symphony, though Threx did not know its name yet, only that it began quietly, almost hesitantly, strings moving beneath one another like something surfacing slowly from deep water, and that it built patiently, deliberately over the better part of an hour toward something his own translation matrix. When he finally looked it up afterward with hands that were not, he told himself, actually shaking, described as an ode to universal brotherhood. Composed by a man who was, by the time he finished writing it, completely and irreversibly deaf. Threx sat with that fact for a long moment after the final movement crashed into its full choral resolution. Hundreds of human voices rising together in a hall gone electric, with an emotion so total that the entire audience rose to its feet, weeping, applauding, some of them embracing total strangers in the aisles. He sat with the fact that the man who wrote this, who built this vast cathedral of sound meant to make thousands of strangers feel joined together across every distance that separated them, had done so without ever being able to hear a single note of it played. He had built it entirely from memory and imagination, and a refusal to let his own broken body be the final word on what he was capable of giving to people he would never meet. Threx Calvain's suppressor, tucked behind his left auditory ganglion exactly as Dominion design specified, registered, for the first time in his 41 years of service, an emotional spike it could not fully dampen. He sat in his seat long after the hall had emptied, and when a member of the cleaning staff politely asked if he was quite all right, he answered, in a voice that came out rougher than he intended, that he was fine. He was simply appreciating the acoustics, a lie so thin he barely bothered finishing it. He filed a report that night that was, by his own later admission in a personal log he never submitted to Fleet Command, the first dishonest report of his career. He wrote that the concert exhibited high emotional manipulation potential consistent with previously observed compromise vectors, and recommended continued caution around large-scale human cultural gatherings, and he could not bring himself to write that he had, for the length of one symphony, forgotten entirely that he was a soldier assessing a target world for potential invasion, and had simply been, for perhaps the first time since he was 4 years old and had a suppressor installed behind his ear, a person listening to something beautiful. The Dominion back home was unraveling in ways that had nothing directly to do with Threx's investigation, and everything to do with the leaked recordings that continued to circulate, quietly, dangerously, through increasingly wide circles of Korvath society. Asa Wren's Carnival footage, Baron Vask's fiddle lesson recordings, smuggled home by a returning supply pilot who'd stopped briefly at the edge of the system and picked up a stray data burst meant for nobody in particular. A recording of Pren Adash's étouffée simmering on a stovetop, 20 full minutes of nothing but the sound of it bubbling and the occasional scrape of a wooden spoon, which should have been the most boring recording in Dominion history and instead became, among a small but growing number of young Korvath who watched it in secret, almost unbearably moving. An entire meditation on the idea that a person might spend 20 minutes of their one finite life making something solely because it would taste good to someone they loved. Assessor Karnath Oz issued 3 separate directives banning the circulation of unauthorized xenocultural material, and each directive only drove the recordings further underground, into private data shares among Korvath teenagers who had never known their own species capable of anything but the calm, and who watched footage of human joy with the specific, aching hunger of people encountering, for the first time, a color they hadn't known was missing from their own eyes. Threx did not know any of this yet. He knew only that his mission was failing in a way no mission of his had ever failed before, not through combat losses, not through logistical failure, but through something closer to erosion, a slow wearing away of the certainty he had walked onto this planet with, one human city at a time. He traveled to a place called Kyoto and stood in a garden of raked white gravel and 5 careful stones, built centuries earlier by monks who understood, apparently exactly what he was only beginning to understand. That stillness itself could be a kind of art, that a species capable of the loud, chaotic joy of a carnival parade was the same species capable of building a garden meant to hold nothing but silence and the patient, deliberate arrangement of stone. He traveled to a place called Marrakesh and ate, from a street vendor whose name he never learned, a piece of grilled lamb seasoned with a spice mixture called Ras el Hanout that unfolded across his tongue in layers, cumin first, then something sweeter, cinnamon perhaps, then a slow-building heat that arrived last, almost as an afterthought. The way a joke arrives last in a story someone has been building toward all along, and he found himself disturbingly wanting a second piece before he had finished processing the first. A want that had no strategic value whatsoever and that he indulged anyway, standing in a crowded market square as the call to evening prayer rose from a minaret somewhere behind him, layering itself over the market's noise in a way that should have sounded discordant and instead sounded, to his own dismayed ears, like harmony. He traveled next to a city called Jaipur, where the 12th Compromise Scout, a former weapons analyst named Corin Vass, had settled into a small workshop tucked behind a spice market, apprenticed to a miniature painter who worked with brushes made from a single squirrel hair, fine enough to render on a canvas no larger than Threx's palm, an entire hunting procession of 100 tiny elephants, each one distinct. Each one caught mid-stride in gold leaf and lapis, and a red so deep it seemed to hold its own light source. Corin had once been responsible for cataloging the maximum sustainable kinetic yield of 43 different weapons platforms without ever once, in 11 years of that work, feeling anything Threx's own instruments could register as distress. Now he spent entire days leaning over a single square inch of ivory-toned paper, breathing so carefully that his own chest barely moved, adding 1 grain of gold at a time to the wing of a painted parrot. And when Threx asked him bluntly why a species capable of art on this scale of patience had also produced something as loud and unrestrained as the carnival drums of Rio, Corin had laughed an actual laugh, unguarded, delighted, and said that Threx had accidentally asked the only question that mattered. "They are not opposites, Admiral," he said. "The patience and the noise, it is the same hunger pointed 2 different directions. A species that can sit still enough to paint a single grain of gold onto a parrot's wing for 6 hours is exactly the kind of species that can also scream with joy in a stadium of 80,000 strangers. Because both things require the same willingness to feel something all the way to its edge, instead of stopping halfway the way we always did." Threx had eaten that evening from a street stall recommended to him by Corin, a plate of food the vendor called pani puri, small hollow spheres of fried dough, cracked open and filled in one motion with spiced potato and a thin, violently cold Tamarind mint water that hit his tongue in a single collapsing wave of sour and sweet and heat, gone in one bite, and he had, against every ounce of his own training, asked the vendor in halting, broken English for another, and then another. Standing in the noise and diesel smoke and marigold and jasmine perfume of a market square as the evening call to prayer rose somewhere behind the spice stalls, and had felt, for the length of 6 small, collapsing bites of food, something dangerously close to belonging. He wrote in the personal log he still told himself he would never submit to anyone, "I am beginning to understand that the anomaly is not a weapon. Prena Dosh was right and I resent him for it. This species did not build joy as a defense. Joy is simply the operating condition they never surgically removed from themselves. We did not encounter an unusually happy species. We encountered, perhaps, the only species we have ever catalogued who still remembers what our own ancestors felt before the calm. And I am beginning to suspect that what we have always called their volatility is in fact simply what it looks like to be alive without a suppressor. And I do not know what to do with the fact that some nights, lying in the borrowed quarters of my ship, I find myself missing a feeling I have never in my life actually had." It was in the city he visited last, a place called Florence, that the final unraveling began. Threx had come there specifically because his investigation had turned up one final compromised scout, the 17th and last, a woman named Ilieth Kor who had gone dark almost immediately after the mission began, earlier even than Prena Dosh. though her file had been misplaced amid the general chaos of the assessor's office and had only surfaced weeks into Threx's own investigation. Iliath, according to the file, had settled not in a bar or a kitchen or a music hall, but in a museum working impossibly, absurdly for a species that had spent 11,000 years training itself out of anything resembling aesthetic wonder. As a restoration assistant, learning to clean centuries of accumulated grime from paintings whose value in purely material terms was negligible compared to the technology the Dominion routinely deployed without a second thought. Threx found her in a small side gallery of the Uffizi, standing before a canvas with a soft brush in one gloved hand, working with a patience that no Korvath soldier should have had time to develop, given how recently she defected. She did not startle when he entered. She told him quietly, been expecting him for weeks. Every compromised scout had a general sense by now, passed between them through the loose, informal network they'd built across the human world, that the Admiral was making his rounds, and that eventually he would find them all. "You've seen the others," Iliath said. It wasn't a question. "I have," Threx said. "And you've filed reports recommending continued surveillance. Caution, restraint." She set her brush down carefully on a small tray. "You haven't recommended quarantine. You haven't recommended kinetic intervention, though you have the authority to. Why not, Admiral?" Threx did not answer immediately, and the silence stretched long enough that Iliath turned fully to face him, her human overlay flickering faintly at the edges the way all the others had, revealing, just at the corner of her jaw, a hint of the blue-gray beneath. "I don't know yet," Threx finally said, and it was the first entirely true sentence he had spoken since landing on this planet. Iliath studied him for a long moment and then did something none of the other compromised scouts had done. She did not try to convince him. She did not offer him food or music or an invitation to some human ritual designed to loosen whatever remained of his resolve. She simply turned, gestured toward the wall behind her and said, "Before you decide anything, look at this. Not as an admiral, just look at it." The painting was not large. It depicted, in swirling, thickly layered strokes of blue and black and impossible electric yellow, a small town beneath a sky that had no business being that, alive stars rendered not as pinpricks of distant light but as vast burning spirals, each one pulling the dark sky around it into motion, the whole heaven caught mid-swirl like something breathing, something turnin'. Over in its sleep. A single dark cypress tree twisted up through the foreground like a flame frozen mid-flicker. Below it all, small and quiet and utterly unremarkable against the churning violence of the sky, sat a sleeping village, windows lit here and there with small warm points of yellow that Threx's eye kept returning to again and again, drawn by some instinct he had no name for. Because amid all that cosmic turbulence, those small lit windows were the only thing in the entire painting that looked like safety. "It's called the Starry Night," Iliath said. "The man who painted it was, by every account his own contemporaries left behind, considered unwell, poor, largely unrecognized in his own lifetime. He struggled. I don't fully understand human psychology well enough to give you the clinical term, but I understand that his mind caused him tremendous suffering, and that he painted anyway, constantly, desperately, as though the only way he knew to survive his own mind was to keep insisting, canvas after canvas, that the world was this beautiful even when he could not always feel it himself. He died believing he had failed. He sold, in his entire life, perhaps one painting. This one now hangs in a museum in New York that receives millions of visitors a year, and I am told that people still weep in front of it, more than a century after his death, because somehow across all that time he managed to put something true inside it, something about how the world can be violent and swirling and completely beyond your control. And still, there can be a small lit window somewhere in it that means someone is home, someone is safe, someone made it through the night." Threx Calvain stood in front of the painting for a very long time. He had, over his 41 years, walked through the aftermath of 3 wars. He had personally overseen the pacification of a species that had, before Dominion intervention, been engaged in a genocide so thorough that entire cultural records had been lost. He had made decisions, cold and necessary decisions, that had ended lives by the thousands in service of what the Dominion called stability. And he had done all of it with a suppressor humming quietly behind his ear, keeping every one of those decisions exactly as flat and manageable as the Dominion required. He looked now at a swirl of blue and yellow paint applied by a suffering, forgotten man more than a century ago on a planet the Dominion had rated a 6 out of 100, and he felt something crack open in his chest that no suppressor, however finely calibrated, had ever been built to hold back, because it had never occurred to the engineers who built it that a species could look directly at its own suffering and choose instead of suppressing it. To turn it into something that made strangers a century later stand very still and feel, for just a moment, less alone. "I was sent here," Threx said, and his voice, for the first time in his adult life, was not flat at all, "to recommend whether this world should be quarantined or destroyed." "I know," Iliath said. "I do not know how to write that report anymore." He was still looking at the painting. "I do not know how to describe what this species has without it sounding like the single greatest weapon any civilization has ever built, and I do not know how to describe it without also admitting that I would rather live 1 year inside it than another century outside." "Then don't write it as a weapon," Iliath said gently. "Write it as what it is. They didn't build this to hurt us, Admiral. They built it because they never learned how to stop feeling things, and somewhere in 6,000 years of never learning how to stop, they figured out that the feeling itself, all of it, the grief and the joy and the ridiculous aching hope, was worth building an entire civilization around. We didn't get invaded. We got reminded." Threx Calvin reached up slowly and touched the small raised scar behind his left ear, where the suppressor had sat, humming its quiet gray hum since he was 4 years old. He did not remove it that day. He was, after all, still an admiral of the Dominion, still bound by 4 decades of discipline that did not simply dissolve because of one painting. However much that painting had managed, in the space of a few silent minutes, to reach past every defense he had ever been built with. He returned to his ship that night and sat for a long time in the cold gray quiet of its cabin, and he drafted and deleted and drafted again a final report to the assessor's office. And what he eventually sent, against every instinct of self-preservation his career should have given him, was not a recommendation for quarantine, and was not a recommendation for kinetic intervention. It was 4 lines, transmitted in full knowledge that they would end his career, and possibly far more than his career, the moment they were read. "The target species is not a threat to be neutralized. It is a mirror we buried so long ago that we forgot we were looking into one. 17 of our best have already chosen to stay inside that mirror rather than return to a life without it. I do not have the authority to make it 18. I am submitting my resignation from active Dominion service, effective the moment this transmission completes, and I am, for what it is worth, going back to look at the painting again tomorrow." He set the transmission to send, watched the small light on his console blink once to confirm delivery, and then he sat very still in the quiet of his ship for a long moment, listening, really listening, for what felt like the first time in 41 years, to the sound of his own held breath. Then he reached up behind his left ear, found the small raised seam where the suppressor sat beneath the skin, and with the same steady hand that had once guided a fleet through the pacification of the Ovar cluster without a single wasted motion, he began, very slowly, to work it free. Outside, beyond the hull of his cloaked ship, Florence was waking into a golden morning, church bells rolling out across red-tiled rooftops in overlapping waves that did not quite align with one another, and were for that very reason achingly beautiful, and somewhere below him a species that his empire had once rated a harmless 6 out of 100 was already filling its markets with the smell of fresh bread, and its cafes with the murmur of 100 small, ordinary, extraordinary conversations, entirely unaware that it had just, without ever firing a single shot, without ever even knowing it was at war, brought an empire 11,000 years old to its knees with nothing more than a trumpet, a bowl of soup, a fiddle by a fire, and a swirl of blue and yellow paint that one broken, hopeful man had once believed wrongly that the world would never care to see. Threx Calvain set the suppressor down gently on the console beside him, and for the first time since he was 4 years old, he let himself feel exactly how frightened, and how alive, and how impossibly, unbearably hopeful he was. Word of an admiral's resignation could not, of course, be purged from the record the way a beach recording or a kitchen video could. It moved through the Dominion not as leaked footage, but as something worse, something the assessor's office had no protocol for at all. A rumor with a rank attached to it. If Threx Calvain, cold, decorated, unshakable Threx Calvain, the officer they had sent specifically because he was the one Korvath in the fleet everyone agreed could not be moved, had chosen to stay, then the question every remaining scout, every dormitory adolescent, every quietly unraveling committee member back home had been almost too afraid to ask finally had its answer. It was not that the 17 scouts had been weak. It was that they had simply been the first to be honest. Within a year, 4 more ships would quietly fail to return from routine border patrols near systems with no strategic value whatsoever, their final logged coordinates all trending, with a consistency that made Carnith Oz's remaining hair go the pale, ceremonial gray his species reserved for grief, toward the same small yellow star. The Dominion never did invade Earth, and it never quarantined it either, because by the time any final order could have been drafted, there were simply no longer enough hands left willing to carry it out. And a species once rated a harmless 6 out of 100 went on, entirely unaware for years afterward, filling its concert halls and its kitchens and its little galleries with the ordinary, extraordinary business of being alive, never once knowing that somewhere above them, an empire 11,000 years old had looked directly at a swirl of blue and yellow paint, and simply, quietly, gladly come undone. Threx went back to the museum the next morning, as promised, and stood again before the small, unassuming canvas with its impossible burning sky. And this time, when the tears came, he did not try to stop them, and he did not look away. Iliath found him there an hour later, still standing in the same spot, and she did not ask him anything, and he did not explain anything. And the two of them simply stood together in the quiet gallery light, 2 former officers of a dead empire's war machine, looking at a small lit window in a painted village beneath a churning, star-drunk sky, and understanding, at last, exactly why someone might choose to stay home for the night.